Every few years, they swap the blueprint. First, they told us to run, then walking was the only safe bet. Suddenly, sitting was the new smoking. They said sugar was pure poison, then honey was a miracle, then all carbs were the enemy, then only certain carbs mattered. In 2012, they swore by fasting windows. By 2018, fasting was ruining your metabolism. By 2024, they were selling powders that supposedly rewired your gut. I stopped keeping track around the time I turned 50. I'm 88 now. I didn't read the journals, didn't join the clinics, didn't buy into the promises. They had their studies, their peer reviews, their glossy magazines. I have my hands. I have the quiet mornings, the sawdust on my boots, the slow accumulation of days that added up to nearly 9 decades. And I'm still here. They aren't all still talking. I could hand you a list. I could tell you exactly what to swallow, what to avoid, how many minutes to sweat, how many hours to sleep, and you could tape it to your refrigerator. But I won't do that. I'm just here to point at the joint you've been ignoring. My name is Elias. I built cabinets for 60 years. I know what happens when you force wood against its natural grain. You clamp it too tight. You ignore the humidity. You rush the drying. You think you can outsmart the material. For a while, it holds. Then the door sticks. Then the frame splits. Then the whole piece bows, and you're left wondering why it failed. People do the same thing to themselves. I spent 6 decades watching men and women try to sand down their own edges, trying to force their bodies into shapes they weren't cut for. I didn't have a fitness tracker until my grandson gave me one in 2019. I wore it for 3 days. It told me my stress was high. I took it off and went back to the shop. You couldn't pay me to explain what a macronutrient ratio is. I've never weighed a portion in my life, and I won't pretend I uncovered some hidden code that all the wellness gurus missed. I didn't. What I have is simpler. I have 88 years of waking up, putting my boots on, and showing up. I learned everything from the workbench, not from a screen. I grew up in rural Ohio. We didn't have health coaches. We had a garden, a cellar, and a wood stove. You ate what the season allowed. Potatoes in autumn, beans in winter, tomatoes in summer. Nobody measured grams. You worked, ate, rested. No algorithm required. Sometime in the late 70s, a salesman left a pamphlet at my shop door. It claimed that natural fats would harden your veins before you turned 50. I read it while the glue dried, tossed it in a coffee tin, and forgot it existed. 20 years later, I found it under a stack of oak shelves. The same company had already rebranded itself, selling a different powder, warning against a different enemy. That was 1978. They've been pivoting ever since. Every time they shift, there's a new reason to feel guilty about the way you've been breathing. I learned early that trends don't age. They just get replaced. You don't build a house on shifting soil, and you don't build a life on shifting advice. I kept my shop door open. I let the years pass like seasons. Spring brings damp wood. Summer brings dry splits. Winter brings stiff joints. You don't fight the weather. You adjust your clamps. You wait. You listen. I worked alongside a man named Arthur for nearly 25 years. He's the reason I'm sitting here saying this. I saw him more than I saw my own brother. Arthur lived by the numbers. He tracked his steps, his sleep cycles, his heart rate variability, his hydration. He read every study the moment it dropped. When the headline said red meat was killing us, Arthur stopped ordering it at the diner. When they said dairy caused inflammation, he switched to oat milk. He measured his portions, timed his meals, wore a monitor on his wrist like a medical bracelet. He knew his resting heart rate down to the decimal. I think it was 58. He'd show it to me like a badge of honor. He woke at 4:30 a.m. every single morning, year after year. Cold rain, heat waves, winter black ice. He did his prescribed routine. The most disciplined man I ever shared a shop with. He told me once over lunch, "Elias, the way you live, you won't see 75. I was eating a roast beef sandwich, heavy on the mustard. He said it gently, like he was mourning me in advance. I just chewed. I didn't argue. I kept eating. Arthur left us at 69. His body didn't warn him. It just shut off. I was 72 when I stood in the back row of his memorial. The man who tracked every variable, still sitting. And I remember the thought cutting through, sharp and quiet. The math doesn't balance. I've watched people outlive their doctors. I've seen how they leave. None of it lines up with the charts. After Arthur, I stopped looking at what people consumed and started looking at what consumed them. The problem wasn't their plates. It wasn't their waistlines. Every single one of them had a hidden stress in the frame. Arthur spent his life terrified of the wrong metric, afraid of a trending headline, afraid of a natural appetite. He spent 2 decades optimizing his life so carefully that he never actually used it. I don't say that to dishonor him. I say it because I watched it unfold day by day, and I missed it until the shop went quiet. Then I looked at my own hands. I had my own tension, too. I've been carrying it for years. The kind you learn to walk around. The kind you call a quirk until it becomes a habit. A habit becomes a decade. My wife Margaret used to say, "Elias, you need to get your blood drawn. You're getting older. We need to see what's going on." I hadn't seen a physician in over a decade when she finally put her foot down. I was 79. She didn't ask. She called the clinic, wrote the address on a receipt, left it on the kitchen table. I went. The doctor was young, early 40s maybe. Clean desk, sharp posture, the kind of confidence that comes from textbooks and clean exams. He ran the panel. Cholesterol, glucose, inflammation markers, liver, kidney, the full sweep. I sat in that paper-lined room, feeling like a patient in a system I'd never joined, while he stared at his screen. He went quiet. Then he turned the chair. "Mr. Vance," he said, "these readings, how are you managing?" I didn't catch his meaning at first. "Managing what?" I asked. "These aren't typical for someone your age," he said. I told him I didn't know what to say. He asked about my diet. I told him I ate meat, potatoes, bread, whatever was on the table. I left out the occasional whiskey because I didn't want to lecture. He asked about supplements. "None," I said. He asked about movement. I told him I lift wood, carry tools, walk to the hardware store, rest when my shoulders tell me to. He started typing faster, like he was trying to pin down a ghost. Then he leaned in and asked the only question that actually mattered. "What's your secret?" Not what I eat, not how I sleep, what I do. I sat there, 80 years old, in a room that smelled like antiseptic, and realized I didn't have a formula. But I knew one thing I hadn't said out loud yet. I never fought my own rhythm. I never punished myself for hunger. I never followed a schedule that felt like a sentence. When every magazine declared carbs the enemy, I looked at my own frame and thought, this body is still carrying weight, still turning screws, still waking up without pills. Why would I sabotage what's already working? The experts were trying to rebuild engines that had already seized. I was just keeping mine oiled. Those are not the same thing. And I know some of you are at war with yourselves while you're still functioning. I watched Arthur count every gram, time every meal, force himself through ice-cold mornings. I always thought, that man is gripping his own life too hard. Discipline born from panic isn't discipline. The body hears that tension and it stores it. Arthur's flaw wasn't his cholesterol. It was 20 years of bracing for impact. I never braced. Not for food, not for aging, not for a number on a screen. I replaced what broke when it broke. I didn't spend my life planning down surfaces that were already smooth. A body isn't a machine you can force into perfect alignment. It's a living system. It bends. When you treat it like a problem to be solved, you create new cracks. When you treat it like a partner, you find your balance. I never needed a manual. I just needed patience. Last autumn, a reporter came to my porch. A young man, serious eyes, voice recorder, leather notebook. Sat in the chair you're sitting in now. Asked about my meals, my routines, my sleep cycles. I answered. Then he asked what advice I'd give to anyone hoping to reach 90. I said, maybe too quickly, stop asking people like me for answers. He smiled, thought I was being modest. I wasn't. Every few years, a new voice will tell you the last one was lying, I said, and they'll be right. And then they'll be wrong, too. That's the cycle. I've watched it turn for 70 years, not a decade, not two. Write that down. He wrote it, closed the book, packed his gear, stood to leave. At the threshold, he turned back. Do you ever worry about how much time you have left? I looked at him. Kid, I've been shaping wood since I was 19. I've never met a craftsman who worries about the grain that hasn't split yet. I eat when I'm hungry. I rest when I'm tired. And I don't follow anyone's manual. I don't argue with my own nature. I stopped spending my days defending myself against rules that change before the ink dries. Now, the joint. You want to know what I mean? Maybe for you, it isn't about food. Maybe it's the conversation you've been avoiding for a decade. Maybe it's the heaviness you carry the moment you open your eyes. Maybe it's the habit you keep calling harmless. You already know what it is. You keep stepping around it and pretending it's stable. I can't name it for you. That's not my role. But I will say this. It isn't on any wellness list. It never was. The stress that actually breaks the frame is rarely the one they're measuring. Find it. Ease it before the whole thing gives way.